You saw the headline, but you probably didn't see the real story hiding underneath it. The headline said the United States launched an attack on Venezuela and that global markets and oil prices reacted fast, as if the movement of prices were a natural reflex, automatic and almost mechanical, like a knee-jerk tapped by a hammer. The surface narrative was clean and familiar. A sudden escalation, a military decision justified by security language, a spike in oil, a dip in equities, analysts on television explaining volatility as though it were weather. It looked like a discrete event, bounded in time, triggered by a clear cause, followed by a predictable reaction. But that version of the story only works if you accept the idea that markets are merely responding, not revealing. It only holds if you believe the attack itself is the central fact, rather than a signal of something much older and much less comfortable that has been moving beneath the surface for years. The official explanation presents the strike as an isolated response to an immediate threat, a tactical decision made in a narrow window of urgency. What it does not explain is why the reaction was so fast, so synchronized, and in some corners so quietly prepared. Oil prices did not rise because traders were surprised. They rose because the system had already priced in the possibility that something like this would happen, and because many of the actors inside that system were positioned not to absorb risk, but to convert it into profit. The speed of the reaction was not evidence of market efficiency, it was evidence of expectation. And expectation in global markets is never neutral. It is shaped by policy signals, by historical patterns, and by the unspoken understanding of who is allowed to disrupt supply and who is expected to pay for that disruption. The public story focuses on Venezuela as a problem state, a destabilizing actor, a source of risk. That framing is convenient because it keeps attention fixed on a single country rather than on the architecture of the global energy system that made the situation fragile long before any missile was launched. Venezuela's oil has been politically toxic for years, not because of its chemistry, but because of who controls it, how it is sanctioned, and which financial institutions are permitted to touch it without consequence. The attack did not create instability in oil markets. It exposed how much instability had already been normalized. What followed in the media was a familiar choreography. Government officials spoke in controlled language about deterrence and proportionality. Market commentators spoke about supply fears and regional risk. Very few spoke about how this moment fits into a longer pattern of managing scarcity through pressure rather than planning, or how repeated shocks have become a feature, not a bug, of a system that rewards volatility more reliably than stability. There was also silence. Not the loud silence of censorship, but the softer, more effective silence of omission. Little was said about workers downstream, about transport costs, about how price spikes filter unevenly through economies already strained by inflation and debt. Little was said about why energy markets remain so exquisitely sensitive to geopolitical tremors, despite decades of promises about diversification and resilience. And almost nothing was said about who precisely benefits when uncertainty becomes the dominant condition of the global economy. The headline invites you to see a cause and an effect. The deeper story asks whether the effect is the point. And if it is, then the uncomfortable question at the end of this first chapter is not why the attack happened, but why so many powerful actors seemed ready for it, and what that readiness tells us about how this system is actually designed to work. The official timeline suggests escalation, decision, action, reaction. It implies a sequence in which political authority moves first and economic systems follow. But when you look more closely, that order begins to blur. Financial markets did not wait for confirmation, nor did energy traders wait for clarity. Positions shifted before statements were fully formed, and narratives hardened before facts could settle. This was not a system reacting to news, it was a system recognizing a familiar pattern and moving accordingly. For years, Venezuela has occupied a peculiar place in the global order. Its oil reserves are vast, but its access to markets has been deliberately constricted. Sanctions, licensing regimes, and financial prohibitions have transformed a resource-rich country into a marginal supplier whose barrels exist more as a geopolitical variable than as a stable component of supply. This is often described as pressure or leverage or containment. Rarely is it described as structural dependence on fragility, because once a market is built around exclusion rather than integration, every disruption becomes amplified. In that context, the attack did not introduce new uncertainty, it activated existing fault lines. Traders understood immediately which shipping routes might tighten, which insurance premiums would rise, which contracts would be repriced. The speed of the response reveals less about fear than about familiarity. This was a scenario that had been rehearsed, not in public, but in spreadsheets, risk models, and internal memos that never appear on camera. Political language, however, remained focused on immediacy. The threat was urgent, the response was necessary, the consequences were unfortunate but manageable. This framing performs an important function. It confines responsibility to the moment rather than to the long chain of decisions that made the moment inevitable. It allows policymakers to speak as if they are managing risk rather than cultivating it. Meanwhile, public debate narrowed. Media coverage oscillated between military analysis and market commentary, treating them as parallel tracks rather than as parts of the same mechanism. Discussions about energy security avoided deeper questions about why so much of the world's economic stability still rests on a system vulnerable to political shocks, and why alternatives, long discussed, remain structurally underdeveloped. Silence filled the gaps where accountability might have formed. The role of influential commentators added another layer. When voices with large audiences frame the event as proof of global weakness, or elite miscalculation, or civilizational decline, they may appear to be challenging power. But often they reinforce the same assumptions: that confrontation is unavoidable, that markets are merely observers, that disruption is an external force rather than an internal feature of the system. The focus stays on personalities and decisions, not on incentives and design. Lost in this discourse are the asymmetries of impact. Energy price volatility does not distribute itself evenly. It transfers cost downward toward consumers, transport workers, manufacturers, and countries with little fiscal space to absorb shocks. At the same time, it creates opportunity upward for firms and funds positioned to trade volatility rather than endure it. This is not accidental. It is how modern risk markets are structured. So when oil prices move sharply on news of an attack, the critical question is not whether markets are nervous, but whether nervousness has become a revenue stream. And if it has, then the deeper discomfort lies here. In a global system where geopolitical tension is no longer a failure to be avoided, but a condition quietly incorporated into profit models. If that is true, then who exactly has an incentive to see these tensions resolved, and who quietly benefits from keeping them unresolved? To understand why this pattern keeps repeating, you have to step back from the event itself and look at the machinery that surrounds it. Modern energy markets are often described as global, liquid, and efficient, but those words conceal an important truth. They are also deeply political, selectively open, and structurally biased toward actors with the capacity to hedge, insure, and arbitrage risk. When disruption occurs, it does not enter a neutral field. It enters a landscape already shaped to channel its effects in predictable directions. The logic is self-protective. Acknowledging that geopolitical interventions routinely destabilize economic systems would require admitting that current frameworks are misaligned with stated goals of stability and prosperity. It would invite scrutiny of alliances between political authority and financial infrastructure that are rarely examined together. Silence, in this context, is not a failure of communication, but a strategy of preservation. There is also a temporal distortion at work. Political cycles are short, market cycles are shorter. Structural consequences unfold slowly. This mismatch allows each domain to claim partial innocence. Politicians point to markets. Markets point to geopolitics. Geopolitics points to security imperatives. Responsibility circulates, but never settles. Meanwhile, the underlying system grows more brittle, even as it appears adaptable. For observers paying attention, this brittleness is visible in subtle ways. Increasing sensitivity to minor disruptions. Declining tolerance for uncertainty among populations with limited buffers. Escalating rhetoric that substitutes for substantive change. Each is a symptom of a system approaching the limits of what normalization can conceal. The role of dissenting voices becomes complicated in such an environment. Critique is often absorbed rather than acted upon. It becomes content, commentary, another signal processed and neutralized by the same structures it seeks to challenge: the appearance of debate masks, the absence of transformation. This gives the illusion of pluralism while leaving core arrangements intact. As the memory of the attack fades, what remains is not resolution, but precedent. Another instance added to a growing archive of moments that quietly redefine what is acceptable, what is expected, and what is no longer questioned. The danger is not that these events shock the system, but that they fail to do so. The tension at the end of this chapter lies in recognizing that systems do not usually collapse under the weight of their contradictions. They persist, adapting just enough to survive until the cost of adaptation itself becomes unsustainable. And the unanswered question is whether we are approaching that threshold or whether we have already crossed it without noticing. At the end of the story, suggested by the headline, there is supposed to be closure. Markets stabilize, statements fade, attention shifts. The episode is archived as another instance of volatility successfully managed. But this sense of ending is largely procedural. It marks the conclusion of coverage, not the resolution of the conditions that made the event both possible and profitable. What the attack on Venezuela ultimately reveals is not the fragility of a single region, but the durability of a system that has learned how to function through disruption. Its strength lies not in preventing shocks, but in absorbing them selectively. Losses are socialized through higher prices, tighter margins, and diminished expectations, while gains are privatized through instruments designed to convert uncertainty into return. Over time, this pattern reshapes political imagination. Stability comes to be understood not as an achievable goal, but as a temporary deviation from an unstable norm. In such a system, escalation does not represent failure. It represents continuity. Each intervention, each spike, each recalibration confirms that the architecture still holds, that it can still transmit signals, reallocate capital, and enforce hierarchy. The absence of breakdown is mistaken for success. Meanwhile, the cumulative strain remains largely unmeasured because it manifests not as collapse, but as erosion. What remains most unsettling is how little friction this process now generates. Public reaction is muted. Institutional discomfort is brief. The moral language once associated with economic harm has been replaced by managerial vocabulary: adjustment, resilience, mitigation. These words suggest care, but they also imply acceptance. They frame endurance as virtue and adaptation as inevitability. The deeper question, then, is not whether similar events will happen again. They will. The question is whether a system that depends on normalization of damage can recognize damage as damage at all, or whether it will continue to interpret every shock as proof of its own sophistication, every recovery as validation of its design. If there is a silence at the end of this story, it is not the silence of ignorance. It is the silence that follows recognition without action, understanding without consequence. And that silence points to a final unresolved tension: whether a world organized to manage instability can ever choose stability, or whether the costs of doing so have already been judged too high by those with the power to decide